Today I will not be talking about my first contact with Japan, which was in this very room in 1999. I was interviewed through those doors for the JET program. I will be talking instead about the first contact between England, a nation on the Isles of Great Britain, and the Isles of Japan. The Gentlemen of Japan, 1587 to 1592. I will talk about the Japanese background later for a reason which will become clear, but first let's deal with England. England in the 16th century was an isolated outlier in Europe with very few friends, to be honest. England had been dreaming of contact with other parts of the world, but especially Japan, Cathay, the Indies, there are many words for those parts, since at least Columbus's time. It was a replacement for local friends. Writings from the time by many philosophers, politicians, sailors present contact with Asia as a kind of panacea to all the national ills that were besetting England at the time. However, they didn't know where it was. Every attempt at navigation to the East Indies failed until in 1580 Drake managed to reach what is now Indonesia, the Spice Isles, which were talked about earlier on by Tim. Then, a few years later, Japan comes to Europe. 4 boys known as the Tensho Embassy from Kyushu, as ambassadors with Jesuit backing, came and toured Catholic Europe. Queen Elizabeth was green-eyed. She was not very happy that she didn't have some Japanese ambassadors touring her country. But of course the Jesuits would never let these Japanese ambassadors anywhere near the Northern Heretics, as Tim called them, which is what they were called. So, a young man called Thomas Cavendish departed Plymouth in July 1586, trying for the Indies, and perhaps trying for Japan, though he didn't actually get there. However, on the way, he took a Spanish ship off what is now Lower California in Mexico. The ship was called Santa Ana. And on this ship were 2 Japanese young men. And this is an extract from Hakluyt, who is the primary chronicler of English exploits of the time. And he published a chapter by Francis Pretty about this voyage. In this chapter, he records, but before his departure, he took out this great ship, that's the Spanish ship, 2 young lads born in Japan, which could both read and write their own language. The eldest, being about 20 years old, was named Christopher. The other was called Cosmos, about 17 years of age, both of very good capacity, intelligent young men. He took them with him to England, and this is there was going to be a pointer. Anyway, if you can see in the middle here, there is a line going through. That is the route which was taken by Cavendish to London. This is the pointer, sorry. Okay, thank you. This is the route taken by Cavendish to London, through the Marianas, Guam, through what is now Indonesia, the Philippines, Indonesia, around Southern Africa to St. Helena, and from St. Helena to Plymouth, where they arrived on September the 9th, 1588, to great astonishment. Not only was the ship filled with treasure, but it also had some secrets on it. Some of those secrets were in the person of these 2 Japanese lads, who were described as gentilshommes, gentlemen, noblemen. They were Queen Elizabeth's replacement for the noblemen which she had not seen the year before. This news went all over Europe and was published in many languages. This is from a French publisher, which is all we have left. We don't have the other languages, even though we know they're there. This is part of this pamphlet which refers to the Japanese lads. Il a aussi amené avec lui quelques gentilshommes indiens venus, comme on dit, de leur propre mouvement de franche volonté. These gentlemen of Japan, of the Indies, but it was Japan, came of their own free will. And the ambassador to France from Venice wrote in a letter to his Doge and to the Senate of Venice, they came through a desire to meet the Queen. This is the news that spread around Europe about these two lads. From Plymouth, after about a month of going through customs and doing various other things, including a lot of propaganda on Cavendish's part, the ship was brought round to Greenwich, not very far from here, but at that time a countryside retreat for Queen Elizabeth. Outside her palace, which is now the Maritime Museum, of course, it looked like this. Outside her palace, Cavendish's ship with the two Japanese lads pulled up, fired a salute, and 5 days later, Queen Elizabeth dined aboard. We don't actually have the detail which says that she met the Japanese lads, but I think we can say with an awful lot of probability that this would have happened. This ship was probably smaller than this room, and therefore they would have been only a few meters away, and also she really wanted to meet them. Cavendish would have been showing them off as well. These gentlemen, these nobles, come from the other part of the world to pay tribute to the Queen. About this time, we also see some of the intelligentsia of England describing their contact with these two young men. Richard Hakluyt, again, his first book, The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics and Discoveries of the English Nation, came out only a few months after these lads had arrived. So he didn't give a particular mention to them within the chapters, though he did in his second version 10 years later. However, what he did do was he amended his introduction to the book to include this amazing event. Is it not strange that the born naturals of Japan are here to be seen agreeing with our climate, speaking our language, and informing us of the state of their eastern habitations? We know from this that they weren't so worried about the rain on a day like this, although they arrived in the rain. That's a recorded fact. And they had made very good use of the 1 year voyaging from Mexico to London, and they had learnt English. This is a key point, as we will see later. Another London member of the literati, Robert Park, who was a merchant, translator, and also an intelligencer, as they called them, also added to his book, which was also published very late that year, 1588. He dedicated it to Thomas Cavendish and mentioned these lads in the dedication at the beginning. But since it is so, as we understand that your worship, having brought home 2 young fellows of good capacity, born in the mighty island of Japan, which hereafter may serve as our interpreters in our first traffic hither, shows us these 2 lads were proficient enough in English to be interpreters and were being trained up to be the key, if you like, to Japan for English traders, for English diplomats to arrive in Japan, which they very much hoped that they would, although it didn't happen for quite a long time, in actual fact. Now I return to the Japanese background, because suddenly these men are not called gentlemen anymore. The fact that they were not nobles was discovered. Who were they, in actual fact? Well, if we look at Japan's background at this time, we can find out more about these 2 lads with a high degree of probability. Japan was a brutal civil war, had been for over a century at this time. There was a total collapse of central government. The country was divided into domains, and warlords dominated various different parts of the country. Piracy and banditry were rife, which led to slaving. Slaving was a common thing during this time. By the 1580s, thousands of people being trafficked abroad each year, mainly from Kyushu, but also from what is now Yamaguchi as well, on Portuguese ships, on Japanese ships, and on Chinese ships as well. Christopher and Cosmos, these 2 lads of Japan, were trafficked to Manila somehow. We're not sure exactly how, but they had to be, because they were on the Spanish ship and they were off Lower California. We know from a court case to do with the taking of the ship that one of them was the valet, the manservant of the canon of Manila, one of the most senior priests in the Philippines. We don't know which one it was, but I suspect it was Cosmas, because he's always referred to as a boy rather than Christopher, who by this time was over 20 and more of a man. Anyhow, by the 1580s, Manila to Acapulco, the route between Asia and Mexico, had been established as the largest route for Asian goods to Europe and to North America. And these two lads, slaves of some sort, you can find out more if you read the book, were on the ship. So they're not gentlemen anymore. But these gentlemen, who are not gentlemen anymore, these men, are still very, very useful, still very interesting. Of course, they can speak English. They have knowledge which nobody else in England has. They start to be called naturalists instead. Naturalist is what we would today call a scientist, somebody who knows information that other people don't. The first and probably the most prominent record of them as naturalists was from William Barlow, who is a clergyman from Lichfield and also a scholar of maritime science, especially magnetism. He wrote in his book called The Navigator's Supply, containing many things of principal importance belonging to navigation. He wrote in his book, some few years since, it so fell out that I had several conferences with 2 East Indians which were brought into England by Master Cavendish and had learnt our language. One of them was Manila, there were also some Filipino boys, and in the Isle of Luzon, the other of Miyako in Japan, which of course is Kyoto today. I questioned with them concerning their shipping and the manner of sailing. They described all things far different from ours. He goes on to describe how they demonstrated the use of the Chinese compass to him, something which was unheard of in Europe at the time, a liquid compass. Europeans used dry compasses. This is an approximation, drawn by my daughter, of what this would have looked like. This is the description from his book. A fish, a steel fish, floating in some water, probably on a pin, and the part that is magnetized is actually the tail, which is strange because it's always the point in Europe, and therefore the tail is which points north, and the head would be pointing south on a compass. This was incorporated into Barlow's compass of variance. The liquid, which was water, would have frozen in many English waters and therefore wasn't used, but the improved needle, steel needle, improved magnetism was used as part of Barlow's compass, which was used for over a century, and William Adams, among other people, almost definitely had one of these compasses to get him to Japan. The next naturalist's record is from a man called Jacques Garret, Jr. He was an apothecary and a botanist from Lime Street, which is near St. Paul's. I had this is a letter in French originally to a scholar called Clusius Carolus in Frankfurt, one of the most important and famous scholars in Europe of the time. This is what Jacques Garret describes his meeting with the boys. Okay, I had the Indians that Cavendish brought here with me and showed my house. I've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to skip through this. Okay, they helped with identifying plants. They helped with identifying drugs, essentially, medicines. And also, we have the first written record of Japanese being written in England, possibly in Europe, which was this lad, Christopher, who wrote down the name in Japanese of this plant. Okay, there are very many other interesting things that these lads contributed to while they were here, including map making, including translation of Chinese maps, including to Emery Molyneux's globe, possibly. That's up for grabs, possibly. Emery Molyneux was on a ship with them for 1 year between Lower California and London. It's unlikely they didn't speak. And on the return voyage, Cavendish's return voyage to Asia, which probably had Japan as its focus, because he took the Japanese lads but didn't take the lads from Manila. We have a record of the first Anglo-Japanese friendship between a man called Anthony Knivet and Christopher. From our first setting forth, blah, 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 okay, time is up, I'm afraid. I will take 10 more seconds to say, sadly, these lads died on their way home to Japan. They didn't make it either to Japan or back to England. And their legacy was such that the first diplomatic letter from England to Japan, from Queen Elizabeth to Hideyoshi, was written a few years afterwards. And possibly William Adams met them because he was married at the same time as they were in London. So we know he was in London. And if you're interested, that is my book, which will be released on the 21st of May, 2024. I'm sorry I had to hurry the last part. Thank you, Leslie.